The morning air was thick with the promise of rain and victory. From the back of her black sedan, Eleanor Vance watched the familiar gray monolith of Vance Tower rise to meet the Chicago sky. Her father had built it. She had perfected it. Today she would make it immortal. Her fingers traced the razor-sharp crease in her trousers. Every detail had to be perfect. The suit was a custom-tailored charcoal wool, a piece of armor forged in London. Her hair was pulled back into a severe bun, not a single strand out of place. Control, it was the only principle that mattered. Her father had understood that. He had wielded it like a weapon. Eleanor had sharpened it to a surgeon's scalpel. Her driver, a silent man named Thomas, who had been with her for 5 years, navigated the final turn into the subterranean parking garage. The polished sedan whispered over the smooth concrete, its tires barely making a sound. This was her domain, a cool, quiet world of ordered lines and designated spaces. The air smelled of damp concrete, cold steel, and the faint, clean scent of her own car's leather interior. The fluorescent lights hummed with a sterile efficiency she found deeply comforting. Everything in her life was arranged just so. Her schedule was calculated to the minute. Her portfolio was balanced to the decimal point. Her world was a fortress of precision, and the CEO parking spot, number 1, was its innermost sanctum. It was more than a place to leave a car. It was a concrete declaration of her authority, painted in stark white letters on the ground. It was the first thing she saw every morning and the last thing she saw every night. It was the foundation upon which her day was built. As the sedan glided around the final concrete pillar, a flicker of wrongness registered in her mind before her eyes could even process the image. The space was not empty. A shape occupied it, a grotesque intrusion of rust and faded color in her monochrome world. Thomas slowed the car to a halt, his posture stiffening almost imperceptibly. Eleanor leaned forward, her perfectly constructed composure cracking for a fraction of a second. It was a truck, not a clean, respectable work vehicle, but a battered, ancient pickup truck. Its paint, once a cheerful blue, had surrendered to years of sun and neglect, peeling away to reveal patches of angry red rust. A dent marred the driver's side door, a long, ugly scar. The truck bed was filled with a jumble of wood scraps, a stained tarpaulin, and a few dull metallic tools. It was an eyesore. It was an infection. It was parked squarely in her spot. A cold, tight fury began to coil in Eleanor's stomach. This was not a mistake. This was a violation. Someone had not only entered her private garage, but had possessed the sheer audacity to claim her space. On this day of all days, the day she would finalize the Ethelred Capital merger, a deal that would cement her legacy, that would finally, definitively prove she was more than just her father's daughter. The driver's side door of the pickup creaked open. A man emerged, unfolding himself from the cab with a slowness that grated on Eleanor's every nerve. He wore a faded flannel shirt, worn jeans, and heavy work boots caked with what looked like dried mud. He was older, perhaps in his late 50s, with a weathered face and kind, tired eyes. He ran a hand through his graying hair and looked around the garage as if he were simply admiring the architecture. Eleanor's door was open before Thomas could even move to assist her. She stepped out, the sharp click of her heels on the concrete like the cocking of a hammer. The man turned toward the sound, his expression mild, curious. He saw her, saw the fury etched into her sharp features, and a flicker of understanding crossed his face. He offered a small, almost apologetic smile. That smile was a lit match to a barrel of gasoline. "Can I help you?" she asked. Her voice was not a question. It was a blade. The man's smile faltered slightly. He gestured vaguely toward his truck. "Morning, ma'am. I think there might have been a bit of a misunderstanding with the front gate. They told me to come down here." His voice was calm, with a gentle, unhurried cadence that felt like sandpaper on her raw nerves. Eleanor let out a short, sharp laugh that held no humor. "A misunderstanding? You think this is a misunderstanding?" She took a step closer, her eyes sweeping over him, from his worn boots to his simple shirt, and then to the rusty heap he had the gall to call a vehicle. "Let me clarify the situation for you. This is a private corporate garage. That spot," she pointed, her finger trembling slightly with rage, "is the designated parking for the chief executive officer of this company. That is me." She paused, letting the weight of her title hang in the air. He just looked at her, his expression patient, waiting. He was not cowering. He was not stammering apologies. He was just watching. It was infuriating. So, unless you have been suddenly and inexplicably promoted to the head of a multi-billion-dollar corporation, she continued, her voice dripping with a condescension, I suggest you explain to me what in God's name you are doing here, and what that piece of scrap metal is doing in my space. The man blinked slowly. My apologies, he said, his tone still even. My name is Sam Jones. I'm here for a meeting. The security guard upstairs, a young fellow named Kevin, I believe, he directed me down, said this was the visitor spot for the top floor. Eleanor felt a wave of incredulous rage wash over her. Kevin, she would have his job. A visitor? For the top floor? Her floor? She imagined this man with his dirty boots and his flannel shirt, walking through the hushed, minimalist elegance of her executive suite. The image was so absurd, so offensive, it was almost physically painful. Sam Jones, she repeated the name as if it were a foul taste in her mouth. I have a meeting this morning, a very, very important meeting that will define the future of this entire company. I can assure you it is not with a carpenter. She gestured dismissively at the wood scraps in his truck. For the first time, a shadow of something other than patience crossed Sam's face. It was not anger, but perhaps disappointment. I understand you have a big day, ma'am. I wouldn't want to cause any trouble. If you could just tell me where I should move. Move? Eleanor's voice rose, echoing in the cavernous space. Oh, it will be moved, but you won't be driving it. She pulled her phone from her pocket. The smooth, cold glass felt solid and reassuring in her hand. A tool of power, a tool of order. Her thumb moved with practiced speed across the screen. I was just trying to explain, Sam started, taking a half step forward. The guard said, Mr. Thorne, I don't care what the guard said, she snapped, cutting him off without looking up from her phone. Her call connected on the first ring. This is Vance, she said, her voice dropping back to its icy, authoritative default. I am in the CEO garage. There is an unauthorized vehicle in my spot, a derelict blue pickup truck. I want it towed, now. There was a brief, tinny voice on the other end, but Eleanor was not listening to questions. She was giving commands. I don't care what the procedure is. I want it gone in the next 10 minutes. Send 2 guards down immediately to handle the driver. She ended the call, the silence that followed feeling profound. She finally looked up at him. Sam Jones stood perfectly still, his hands hanging loosely at his sides. The gentle look in his eyes was gone, replaced by a quiet, searching gaze. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and for a moment Eleanor felt a strange, unwelcome prickle of self-consciousness. It felt as if he were seeing something more than the suit, more than the title, as if he were looking at the architecture of her character and finding it flawed. She crushed the feeling instantly. It was weakness, a flicker of her father's disapproval from some long-buried memory. What did this man's opinion matter? He was a nobody, a piece of grit in the gears of her perfectly calibrated machine, a problem to be eliminated. Your truck will be taken to the city impound lot, she said, her voice flat and final. You can find the address at the front security desk on your way out. I suggest you take a taxi. 2 security guards, young men in crisp uniforms, came jogging around the pillar. They saw Eleanor, then the man in the flannel shirt, and their expressions became a mixture of apprehension and resolve. They knew her temper. Ms. Vance, the first guard said, slightly out of breath. We got the call. Good, Eleanor said, not bothering to look at him. Her gaze was fixed on Sam Jones. She wanted to see him humbled. She wanted to see the quiet confidence in his eyes break. Escort this man out of the building. Make sure he understands he is not welcome back. And wait here until the tow truck arrives. I want confirmation that the vehicle is gone. Yes, Ms. Vance, the guard said, motioning for his partner to approach Sam. Sam did not resist. He simply gave a small, slow nod. He looked from the approaching guards to Eleanor. He opened his mouth as if to say one last thing, but then seemed to think better of it. He closed it, a quiet resignation settling over his features. He had accepted his dismissal. He had accepted his place. This was how the world worked. There were people who gave orders, and there were people who followed them. There were people who owned the towers, and there were people who parked their rusty trucks in the wrong place. The lines had to be clear. They had to be enforced. Eleanor gave him one last withering glance. She saw a man in a rumpled shirt, a problem now being handled by her subordinates. She saw an obstacle that had been efficiently removed. She saw nothing else. She turned, her back straight, her posture radiating an unassailable authority. The sharp click of her heels resumed its steady, rhythmic beat as she walked toward the gleaming steel doors of the private elevator. Thomas had already exited the sedan and was holding the door for her, his face a perfect mask of neutrality. He had seen her like this before. She did not look back. She did not want to see the guard speaking to the old man. She did not want to see him watch his life's possessions being prepared for seizure. The details were beneath her. The problem was solved. That was all that mattered. As she stepped into the elevator, she caught her reflection in the polished steel, the severe suit, the taut hairstyle, the piercing blue eyes. She saw the image of power. She saw her father's daughter, ready to ascend. A righteous surge of energy flowed through her, a feeling of absolute control restored. She had faced an irritant, a disruption to her perfect order, and she had crushed it without a moment's hesitation. It was a good omen for the day ahead, a sign of the decisiveness that would win her the ultimate prize. The elevator doors slid shut, sealing her in a silent, ascending capsule of steel and glass. She was rising, leaving the damp, concrete world of inconvenience and common men far below. She smoothed the front of her jacket, took a deep, steadying breath, and focused her mind on the billion-dollar handshake that awaited her on the top floor. Down in the garage, the tow truck had just been dispatched, and Sam Jones was being politely but firmly asked to leave. Eleanor Vance felt nothing but the pure, clean satisfaction of a world put back in its proper order. The elevator doors closed, sealing Eleanor Vance in a capsule of brushed steel and silent upward motion. The low hum was the only sound, a gentle vibration that seemed to scrub the morning's unpleasantness from her skin. She watched the floor numbers climb, each illuminated digit a step further away from the concrete dust and exhaust fumes of the garage. The memory of the man, his worn flannel shirt, and the defiant rust on his truck was an irritation she had already mentally discarded. It was a piece of grit in the otherwise flawless machinery of her day. He was a problem, and problems were meant to be solved, removed, and forgotten. Her world was up here, not down there. As the elevator slowed with a nearly imperceptible sigh, her reflection sharpened in the polished doors. Sharp, angular features, piercing blue eyes that missed nothing. Her dark hair was pulled back into a severe, immaculate bun, not a single strand out of place. It was a face built for boardrooms, for unblinking negotiation, for command. It was the face she had painstakingly constructed over the years, a mask of impenetrable confidence to hide the constant, gnawing fear of being seen as her father's daughter, and nothing more. Today that fear would be extinguished forever. The door slid open onto the top floor of Vance Tower. The Summit boardroom. The air here was different, thin and cool and tasting of nothing at all. It was the sterile atmosphere of pure power. Sunlight flooded the space, pouring through floor-to-ceiling windows that wrapped around the room, turning the Chicago skyline into a breathtaking, silent mural. The city sprawled below, a concrete and glass kingdom laid out for her inspection. Her kingdom. From this height, the cars were metallic insects, the people, insignificant specks. Down there, a man was probably arguing with a tow truck driver. Up here, history was being made. At the center of the room sat a colossal mahogany table, polished to a dark, liquid gleam. It reflected the sky and the clouds, making it seem as if they were all floating. At the far end, Marcus Thorne rose to his feet. He was a man sculpted from silver and charm. His hair was a perfect, sweeping wave of silver. His suit was a shade of charcoal so dark it was nearly black, tailored with a precision that spoke of old money and older power. His smile was his most effective weapon, a flash of white that was both disarming and predatory. "Eleanor, young," he said, his voice smooth and polished as the table between them. "Punctual as ever. I do admire that." She walked toward him, her heels making no sound on the thick, charcoal gray carpet. The silence in this room was absolute. designed to amplify every word, every shift in weight, every subtle tell or tone. She extended a hand, her grip firm and brief. Marcus, I don't believe in wasting time. Not on a day like this. Nor do I, he replied, his cold eyes crinkling at the corners as his smile broadened. He gestured to the chair opposite him. Please. As she sat, her team took their places along one side of the table, a silent row of lawyers and financial officers. Marcus's own people mirrored them on the other side. Her assistant, Chloe Davis, took a seat just behind her, a quiet and grounding presence. Eleanor barely registered them. Her focus was entirely on Marcus, the final gatekeeper to her triumph. I was just speaking with my team, Marcus began, settling into his own chair. He steepled his fingers, a gesture of thoughtful authority. We were remarking on the efficiency of this entire process. It's been quite extraordinary. You've navigated a very complex merger with remarkable speed. Eleanor felt a familiar surge of pride, warm and sharp. This was the validation she craved. My father believed that hesitation was the parent of missed opportunity. I simply improved on the model. Ah, yes, your father. Marcus leaned back slightly, his gaze drifting toward the skyline. Thomas Vance, he was a builder, a brilliant one. He laid a magnificent foundation, but it takes a different kind of vision to build an empire on that foundation. It requires a certain ruthlessness. He looked back at her, his eyes locking onto hers, a quality he admired but perhaps never fully possessed himself. You, on the other hand, have it in spades. The words landed exactly as he intended. They were a tribute not just to her skill, but to her superiority. She had not just matched her father, she had surpassed him. Thomas Vance was a beloved figure, a titan of industry who built his company on handshakes and integrity. But in Eleanor's mind, his methods were outdated. His sentimentality of vulnerability. He saw people. She saw assets and liabilities. The man in the garage was a liability. Marcus was an asset. It was that simple. Her inner voice, usually a critic, was for once a chorus of approval. This is the moment. This is the pinnacle. Every late night, every sacrificed relationship, every ruthless decision has led you here. You didn't just inherit a kingdom, you conquered a new one. Ruthlessness is just clarity in a world that prefers ambiguity, she replied, her voice cool and even. She would not let him see the thrill his words gave her. A perfect sentiment, Marcus chuckled softly. Clarity, I'll have to remember that. He slid a massive, leather-bound document across the table. It moved with a heavy, expensive whisper. The embossed logos of Vance Innovations and Ethelred Capital gleamed in the light. The merger agreement, the prize. Well then, he said, shall we make it official? Eleanor looked at the document. It was more than paper and ink. It was the physical manifestation of her life's ambition. It was the final chapter in her father's story and the explosive first chapter of her own. She thought of him, imagining him standing behind her. For years she had felt his ghost judging her, weighing her decisions against his own code. She had always fallen short in his imagined gaze, but now she felt a different presence. Not judgment, but awe. She was doing what he never could. She was ensuring the Vance name would not just survive, but dominate for another century. Her CFO, a cautious man named Arthur, cleared his throat. Eleanor, the final review from our legal team confirmed all terms are, as we discussed. It's solid. She gave him a curt nod, not taking her eyes off the document. It was a formality. She had read every line herself 3 times. She knew the contract better than she knew the faces of some of her own relatives. It was a masterpiece of corporate strategy, her strategy. Marcus produced a pen from his breast pocket. It was a heavy black and gold fountain pen. He didn't offer it to her, but placed it deliberately on top of the agreement. A final theatrical flourish. The choice to pick it up was hers. Eleanor reached out. Her hand was perfectly steady. Her fingers felt like cool, polished steel as they wrapped around the pen. It was heavier than it looked. She thought for a fleeting, absurd moment of the greasy tools in the back of that pickup truck. The rusted metal, the worn wood handles. Tools for taking things apart, for fixing what was broken. This pen was a different kind of tool. It was a tool for creation and for conquest. She uncapped it with a soft click that echoed in the silent room. Her gaze fell upon the signature line at the bottom of the final page. Eleanor C. Vance. Below it, the title she had fought for and defended with every fiber of her being. Chief Executive Officer, Vance Innovations. Chloe shifted slightly behind her. Eleanor could feel her assistant's quiet anxiety, a subtle energy in the air. Chloe was loyal, and she worried too much. She saw risk where Eleanor saw opportunity. But her concern was a whisper against the roaring tide of Eleanor's triumph. She looked across the table at Marcus. He was watching her, his expression one of polite, patient anticipation. He looked like a mentor overseeing his star pupil's graduation. He was the established power welcoming her into the fold. This deal wasn't just about money or market share. It was about acceptance. It was about finally taking her seat at the head of the table, a table where men like Marcus Thorne and her father had always sat. She lowered the nib to the paper. The ink was a deep, rich black. She began to write her name. The loops and strokes were confident, sharp, and decisive, just like her. With each letter she formed, she felt the weight of her father's legacy transforming. It was no longer a burden to be carried, but a pedestal to stand upon. The ink bled slightly into the thick, creamy paper, a permanent mark, an act that could not be undone. She finished the final flourish of the E in Vance and lifted the pen. Done. For a heartbeat, the room remained perfectly still. The only sound was the distant, imagined hum of the city far below. It was the sound of her new empire breathing. She placed the pen carefully back on the table, her work complete. Then the silence was broken. A wave of polite, restrained applause started from Marcus's side of the table and was picked up by her own. It wasn't a roar of celebration, but the respectful, measured sound of a transaction of immense scale being concluded. Her lawyers were smiling, relief evident on their faces. Her CFO gave her a proud, affirming nod. It was over. She had won. A small, tight smile finally touched Eleanor's lips. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated victory. She had done it. She had taken her father's company and forged it into something bigger, something stronger, something that would be feared and respected. She had secured her name in the annals of business history. She raised her eyes to meet Marcus's across the table. He was clapping along with the others, his charismatic smile firmly in place. He nodded at her, a gesture of congratulations, of welcome. But as her gaze held his, she saw it. For just a fraction of a second, the polite mask wavered. The smile on his lips did not reach his eyes, and in their cold silver depths, a light flickered. It was not celebration. It was not respect. It was the glint of a closing trap, the cold, final satisfaction of a predator who had just watched its prey willingly walk into the snare. The applause around her suddenly sounded distant and hollow, like the patter of rain on a coffin lid. The polite applause faded, but the sound still echoed in Eleanor Vance's ears. It was the sound of her own name being carved into history. She stood, her spine straight, her posture a silent declaration of power. The pen, a custom Mont Blanc her father had received from a head of state, felt cool now in her hand. Moments ago, its nib had scratched across the page, a sound as final and as binding as a vault door locking shut. Her signature, a sharp, angular slash of black ink, was still drying on the last page of the agreement. It was done. Her lawyers were beaming, their faces flushed with the thrill of a major victory. Board members, men who had known her since she was a girl in pigtails trailing her father through these halls, approached with outstretched hands. Their congratulations were a low, reverent murmur. She accepted their handshakes with a firm, practiced grip. She offered tight, controlled smiles that conveyed authority, not warmth. Inside, a wild, soaring music was playing, a symphony of ambition fulfilled. This was more than a merger. It was an ascension. A server in a crisp white jacket appeared at her elbow, offering a flute of champagne from a silver tray. The bubbles rose in a frantic, celebratory dance. Eleanor took the glass, her fingers cool against the crystal. She brought it to her lips, the taste sharp and cold on her tongue. It tasted like victory. It tasted like vindication. Across the room, Marcus Thorne was surrounded by his own team. He raised his glass in her direction, a silent acknowledgement from one predator to another. Eleanor met his gaze and gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. He had fought well, but she had won. She felt a phantom presence beside her, the ghost of her father's approval. He had built this company, Vance Innovations, from nothing. He had forged it with his sweat and his formidable will. But he had always been cautious, content to consolidate, to protect. He had never dared to make a move this audacious. He had never had the courage to risk it all for the chance to become a true titan. Eleanor had that courage. Today, she had not just secured his legacy, she had surpassed it. The company was no longer just his, it was hers, and she had made it immortal. Her assistant, Chloe Davis, moved through the celebrating executives with quiet efficiency. She refilled glasses, murmured pleasantries, and ensured the delicate social machinery of the moment ran without a single hitch. Eleanor watched her for a moment. Chloe was loyal, competent, a perfect instrument, but she lacked the fire, the consuming hunger that drove people like Eleanor, like Marcus, like her father. Chloe saw a job to be done. Eleanor saw a world to be conquered. The initial crescendo of excitement began to subside, softening into the comfortable hum of a successful conclusion. Small groups formed, the conversation turning to market reactions, to logistical next steps, to the celebratory dinner planned for the evening. Eleanor felt a need to separate herself, just for a moment, to savor the feeling in its purest form. She drifted away from the crowd, her heels making no sound on the thick plush carpet. She walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows that formed the west wall of the summit boardroom. The city of Chicago spread out below her, a breathtaking panorama of steel and glass and human endeavor. The late afternoon sun painted the sky in shades of orange and deep purple, and the first lights of evening were beginning to flicker to life in the towers that stretched to the horizon. She owned this, not literally, not every building and street, but the view, the feeling of looking down upon it all, from this height. This was the perquisite of power. This was the spoils of war. For years, she had looked out this same window and seen her father's empire. Now she saw only her own. A quiet satisfaction settled over her, deep and solid. The constant, gnawing insecurity that had been her shadow for years finally seemed to recede, burned away by the bright glare of her success. A soft cough behind her broke the spell. Eleanor did not turn. She knew it was Chloe. She could feel the younger woman's hesitant energy. "What is it, Chloe?" she asked, her voice even, her eyes still fixed on the skyline. "Ms. Vance, I am so sorry to interrupt," Chloe began, her tone respectful but strained. "I know this is a moment to celebrate, but—" Eleanor finally turned, a flicker of annoyance crossing her features. "But what? The caterer used the wrong kind of olive? The floral arrangements are drooping?" She kept her voice low, but there was an edge to it. She would not allow some trivial detail to mar this perfection. "No, Ms. Vance, it's a market alert." Chloe held up a sleek, black tablet. Her hand was perfectly steady, but Eleanor noticed her knuckles were white. "It's about our stock." Eleanor let out a soft, dismissive sigh. She took a deliberate sip of her champagne before deigning to look. "Chloe, the markets are emotional. They are irrational. A deal of this magnitude always causes ripples. It's to be expected." "I know," Chloe said, her gaze unwavering. "But it's not a ripple. Not exactly." She angled the tablet so Eleanor could see it clearly. On the screen was a graph, a jagged green line tracking the performance of Vance Innovation stock. Ticker symbol VIN. For most of the day, the line had been stable, even climbing slightly in anticipation of the announcement. But at the far right of the graph, in the last 30 minutes, the line took a sudden noticeable dip. It was not a crash. It was not a plunge. It was a sharp downward hook, like a snag in a perfect piece of fabric. Eleanor stared at the image for a second. A tiny, unwelcome knot formed in her stomach. It was unexpected, but it was not catastrophic. Not yet. Her mind, sharp and analytical, immediately supplied the logical explanation. "It's last-minute profit-taking," she said, her voice regaining its confident clip. "Traders who bet on the merger are cashing out, or it's algorithmic trading reacting to the keyword acquisition. It is meaningless noise, Chloe. The fundamentals are stronger than ever. In an hour when the full details are released, it will correct itself. It will soar. She waved a dismissive hand at the tablet. I don't want to see this. We are celebrating the single greatest achievement in this company's history. Do not bring me trivialities. Do not bother me with market jitters. Chloe's expression did not change, but she held Eleanor's gaze for a moment too long. There was a depth of concern in her eyes that went beyond simple data. Of course, Miss Vance, I'm sorry. See that you are, Eleanor said, her voice colder than she intended. She felt a flash of irritation at Chloe for her persistence, for daring to introduce a sour note into her symphony. She turned her back on her assistant, a clear dismissal, and faced the window again. But the view had changed. The city lights seemed sharper now, colder. The satisfaction she had felt just moments before was clouded by a thin haze of annoyance. The perfect moment had been tarnished. She tried to force the image of the graph from her mind. It was nothing. A blip. The paranoid twitching of an anxious market. She was Eleanor Vance. She had just architected a multi-billion-dollar merger that would be taught in business schools for generations. She was not going to be rattled by a tiny fluctuation in a stock price. She took another long swallow of champagne, the cold liquid a balm against the unwelcome heat of her irritation. She willed the feeling of triumph to return, to flood her senses and wash away the doubt. Behind her, she heard Chloe's quiet footsteps retreating. The hum of conversation in the room seemed to swell to fill the space she had left. Eleanor closed her eyes for a second, composing herself. She would not let this bother her. She would not. She was in control. When she opened her eyes, she turned back to the room, a placid, authoritative smile fixed on her face. Her team was laughing with some of the Ethel-Red lawyers. Good. Let them build bridges. Her own board members were talking in a hushed, excited cluster near the massive mahogany table, their hands gesturing toward the leather-bound agreement that still sat in the center, a sacred text. Everything was as it should be. Everything was perfect. Her gaze swept the room, an empress surveying her court. And then her eyes met Marcus Thorne's. He was standing alone now, near the edge of his own group, separated by a few feet of empty space. He was not speaking to anyone. He was simply watching her. He had been watching her the whole time. The realization sent a strange prickle across her skin. The noise and motion of the room seemed to fade into the background, the scene narrowing to just the two of them, separated by 20 yards of charged air. He was holding his own champagne flute. Slowly, deliberately, he raised it a few inches, a small salute meant only for her. Eleanor watched, her own glass frozen halfway to her lips. She expected him to nod or to offer a thin, professional smile of acknowledgement. He did not. Instead, a slow smile spread across Marcus Thorne's face. It was unlike any expression she had ever seen from him. It was not the charming, charismatic smile he used in negotiations. It was not the collegial smile he had given her after the signing. This was something else entirely. It was a private, knowing smile. It was the smile of a man who was savoring a secret joke, a punchline that only he had heard. It started at the corners of his mouth, pulling them upward, but the expression never touched his eyes. His eyes, she saw now, were as cold and still as a frozen lake. They held no warmth, no celebration. They held only the flat, chilling light of absolute victory. The smile lingered, aimed directly at her, a silent, devastating message she could not comprehend. And in that moment, Eleanor felt a sudden, shocking chill, a wave of cold so profound it felt as if someone had opened a window to a winter storm. It had nothing to do with the air conditioning. It was a deep, internal coldness that started in her stomach and radiated outward, raising the fine hairs on her arms. An involuntary shiver traced a path down her spine, a tremor her iron will could not suppress. The magnificent view of the city, her newly conquered kingdom, seemed to vanish from her peripheral vision. The low murmur of the party became a distant, meaningless buzz. All that existed was the space between them, and that slow, terrible smile. It was a smile that did not celebrate a partnership. It celebrated a kill. That smile on Marcus Thorne's face lingered in her mind. An unpleasant afterimage burned onto her retinas. It was the smile of a chess player who sees a checkmate 10 moves away. Eleanor forced it from her thoughts. This was her victory. She had won. The polite applause had died down. replaced by a low, contented murmur of conversation. Board members from both companies were mingling, shaking hands, their faces alight with the promise of this new powerful entity. Champagne was being poured into tall, delicate flutes. The sound, a gentle fizz and pop, should have been celebratory. To Eleanor, it suddenly sounded like air escaping a punctured tire. She picked up her pen, a heavy silver instrument her father had given her, and rolled it between her fingers. The cold metal was usually a comfort, a solid, tangible piece of her authority. Now it felt slick, difficult to hold. That shiver of unease she'd felt moments ago returned, a cold trickle down her spine that had nothing to do with the room's air conditioning. It was irrational. Everything was perfect. The deal was signed, her legacy was secure. Then she saw Chloe. Her assistant was standing near the doorway, her shoulders tight, her posture rigid. She had left only minutes ago, a brief, dismissive interaction that Eleanor had already filed away. But she was back, and the look on her face was no longer one of mild concern. It was a mask of stark, undisguised dread. Chloe's eyes met hers across the expansive room, a silent, desperate plea. Other people were starting to notice. A few conversations faltered as heads turned toward the pale, frozen figure by the door. Eleanor felt a flash of hot anger. This was unprofessional, unacceptable. Whatever it was, it could wait. This was her moment, her triumph, and Chloe was painting a scene of crisis in the middle of it. With a tight, forced smile for the Ethelred executive sitting beside her, Eleanor excused herself. Her movements were sharp, clipped, as she walked the long distance across the polished floor. The click of her heels on the marble was the only sound she heard, a metronome counting down to an annoyance she was about to crush. "Chloe, what is it?" she said, her voice a low, dangerous hiss. "This better be important enough to risk your career over." Chloe didn't flinch. She simply held up the tablet again. Her hand was trembling slightly. "Eleanor, you need to look. Now." Eleanor's gaze dropped to the screen, her breath caught in her throat. The small 2% dip was gone. In its place was a cliff, a sheer vertical drop in screaming red. Vance Innovations stock, a bedrock of stability for 50 years, was in free fall. It was down 10%. Now 11. The numbers were updating in real time, each flicker a drop of blood. It was a hemorrhage. "No," Eleanor whispered. The word had no force. It was a puff of air. "That's not possible. It's a data error, a glitch in the system." She looked up from the tablet, scanning the room for some explanation, some anchor in reality. But the world inside the boardroom was unchanged. People were still smiling, still sipping champagne. They were celebrating the value of a company that was, at this very second, evaporating into thin air. A wave of nausea washed over her. The panoramic view of the city suddenly seemed to tilt, the horizon unsteady. Her personal phone, tucked inside her suit jacket, began to vibrate. The vibration was frantic, insistent. She knew who it was without looking. Only one person would use this line in a situation like this. Pulling it out, she saw the name flash on the screen. David Chen, her chief financial officer. A man who prided himself on his unflappable calm. A man who had weathered 2 market crashes without so much as raising his voice. She turned her back to the room, creating a fragile illusion of privacy. Her thumb hovered over the screen before she answered. "David," she said, her voice miraculously steady, "tell me what's happening." The voice that came through the speaker was one she had never heard before. It was tight, strained, laced with a panic so profound it was almost unrecognizable. "Eleanor, where are you? We have a catastrophic situation. The stock is collapsing. We're down almost 15% in 20 minutes." "I see that, David," she snapped, the fear transmuting into anger. "I need to know why. Is there news? Did something leak? Was there an accident at one of the plants?" Panic was a luxury she could not afford. She needed reasons. She needed problems she could solve. "No, that's the thing," he sounded breathless. "There's nothing. Zero. No news, no filings, no analyst downgrades. I've had my team scouring every wire, every chat room, every dark corner of the web. There is no reason for this. It's just falling. It feels targeted. It feels orchestrated." Orchestrated. The word hung in the air, cold and heavy. Eleanor's eyes instinctively flickered across the room to Marcus Thorne. He was in conversation with one of her board members, a warm, reassuring smile on his face as he gestured toward the city view. He looked completely at ease, too at ease, the predator feigning sleep after a successful hunt. The smile he had given her earlier was not a premonition of checkmate. It was the signal that the trap had just been sprung. Sell-off triggers are kicking in, David continued, his voice cracking. It's compounding. The algorithms are chasing the price down. Eleanor, I can't stop it. We're about to be halted for volatility. What do I tell the exchange? What do I tell our people? Eleanor's mind raced, a whirlwind of frantic calculations and dead ends. Her father had always told her, in any crisis, control the narrative. Get ahead of the story. But there was no story. There was just a void, a black hole opening up beneath her company. Say nothing yet, she commanded, her knuckles white as she gripped the phone. Hold the line. I'm in the boardroom. I will handle it from here. She ended the call without waiting for a reply. The silence that followed was deafening. The cheerful hum of the room was now a grating, alien sound. She felt 100 pairs of eyes on her, though she knew it was only her imagination. The pressure was immense, a physical weight on her chest. She had to do something. She had to project absolute confidence, even as her own was shattering. She walked back toward the main table, her posture ramrod straight. She ignored Chloe, who was still standing by, a ghost at the feast. She walked past the smiling faces and the clinking glasses. She stopped at the head of the table, where her legal team was gathered, packing their briefcases, their work seemingly done. Unpack, she said, the word cut through the air. The two senior lawyers, both men in their 50s who had served her father for decades, looked up at her, confused. Eleanor? One of them, a man named George, asked. Is everything all right? No, George, everything is not all right, she said, her voice low and sharp for their ears only. Our stock is in a nosedive. We are facing a coordinated attack. She did not know if that was true, but she needed to frame it as a battle, something to be fought. The lawyers exchanged a look of disbelief. One of them discreetly pulled out his phone. His eyes widened in shock as he saw the numbers. My God, he whispered, I don't need prayers. I need solutions. Eleanor snapped, her patience gone. The fear was a wild animal in her chest, and she was caging it with anger. The agreement. Get it out, now. A junior lawyer, a young man named Thomas, who she barely knew, fumbled to reopen his briefcase. He pulled out his copy of the merger agreement, the thick, heavy document that had felt like a trophy just minutes before. Now it looked like an anchor. Find me a clause, Eleanor commanded, her voice a whip crack. Find me an out, a material adverse change clause, something that gives us leverage, something that protects us from this. Ethelred must have known this was coming. Her mind was scrambling. If Marcus had orchestrated this, it had to be a breach of good faith. There had to be something in the fine print that she could use against him. I need something to tell my board. I need something to stop this bleeding. Now, read. The command hung in the air. The senior lawyers, momentarily stunned by her ferocity, sprang into action. They flipped open their own copies, their faces grim. The quiet rustling of hundreds of pages being turned in unison filled the small space around the head of the table. It was a sound of desperation. They were searching for a shield in a document they had helped write, a document they believed was flawless. Eleanor stood over them, her arms crossed, a statue of tense authority. Her heart was pounding against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of terror. She could feel Marcus Thorne's gaze on her back, a physical pressure. She refused to turn. She refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing her panic. She just stared down at the pages, a meaningless blur of black text on white paper. It was all there. Her entire future, her father's legacy, written in legalese she suddenly could not comprehend. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The murmuring in the room was quieting down. The initial excitement was waning, replaced by a sense of confusion. Board members were starting to check their phones. A worried whisper spread like a virus. The atmosphere was changing from celebration to a wake. Anything? Eleanor demanded, her voice strained. George shook his head, his face pale. The MAC clause is standard, Eleanor. It's written very tightly in Ethelred's favor. It defines a material adverse change as something that impacts the long-term earning potential of the company. A short-term stock fluctuation, even a severe one, would not trigger it. He looked defeated. They walled us in. Walled in. The words echoed Eleanor's own feeling of being trapped. No, impossible. She had read it. Her team had read it 100 times. They were the best. They would not miss something. Keep looking, she ordered, her voice trembling with a rage that was barely contained fear. There has to be something else. A covenant, a condition, anything. The pages turned faster, more frantically. The rustling was louder now, more desperate. It was the sound of men searching for a single word that could save an empire. Eleanor's gaze swept over her team, from the seasoned partners to the associates. And then her eyes landed on the junior lawyer, Thomas. He had stopped turning pages. He was completely still. His face, which had been flushed with the effort of the search, was now utterly devoid of color. It was the color of chalk, of bone. He sat frozen, his briefcase forgotten on the floor beside him. His entire focus was on the page in front of him. His right hand was flat on the document, as if to hold it down, to stop it from escaping. His left index finger was extended, resting on a single short paragraph halfway down the page. It was not shaking. It was perfectly unnaturally still, as if pointing to the site of a fatal wound. He did not look up. He did not speak. He just stared at the words, his mouth slightly open, a silent gasp caught in his throat. The other lawyers had not noticed him yet. They were still frantically searching, lost in their own panic. But Eleanor saw him. In that moment, the entire noisy, chaotic room faded away. There was only the young man, his white face, and his finger resting on a block of text in the heart of the agreement. A block of text she had signed without a second thought. And in the profound, terrifying stillness of his posture, Eleanor felt a cold that had nothing to do with unease and everything to do with absolute certainty. They had not found a shield. He had found the knife. The air in the summit boardroom, once charged with victory, had grown thin and cold. All eyes were fixed on the junior lawyer, a young man named Thomas, whose face had lost all its color. His finger, stark white at the tip, was pressed against a paragraph in the massive merger agreement. It was as if he had touched something venomous, and the poison was crawling up his arm. Eleanor's irritation curdled into a tight knot of apprehension. The murmurings from her financial team had ceased. The polite, celebratory chatter was gone. All that remained was the hum of the ventilation and the frantic beating of her own heart against her ribs. She could feel Marcus Thorne's gaze on her from across the table, patient and heavy. "What is it?" Eleanor's voice was a sharp crack in the silence. "Thomas, speak, now." The young lawyer swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. He looked helplessly at Eleanor's chief counsel, a man 20 years his senior, who now looked just as lost. He cleared his throat, but only a dry rasp came out. He tried again. It's clause 11.7, subsection B, he stammered, his eyes darting from the page to Eleanor, then back again, as if the words themselves might leap off the paper and attack him. "I am aware of the document structure," Eleanor said, her voice dangerously low. She placed her hands flat on the cool mahogany table, anchoring herself. "Read the clause." Aloud. Thomas took a shaky breath. His voice, when it came, was a reedy, trembling thing, completely out of place in this chamber of power. It states, in the event of a significant, unforeseen degradation of Vance Innovations' share value, defined as a decline exceeding 15% from the market open on the day of signing, prior to the finalization of asset transfer. He paused, his eyes wide with horror. Eleanor felt a cold wave wash over her. 15%. The last update from Chloe had them down 12. Her mind raced. It was an aggressive drop, but it was just market panic. It would recover. It had to. "Go on," she commanded, though a strange metallic taste was beginning to coat her tongue. Thomas continued, his voice barely a whisper. Ethelred Capital reserves the right to trigger an immediate and binding transfer of majority voting shares, as outlined in Appendix C, to protect the primary stakeholders' investment and ensure market stability. The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. For a moment, there was only utter, uncomprehending silence. Eleanor stared at the lawyer, her mind refusing to assemble the sentence into a coherent thought. It was legal jargon, standard protection, boilerplate language to appease the risk-averse. Her lawyers had been over this document 100 times. She had been over it. Her chief counsel finally spoke, his voice hoarse. That's a poison pill. But it wasn't their pill. It was aimed directly at them. Eleanor's gaze snapped to the large screen on the wall, still displaying the live market data. The red arrow next to her company's stock symbol was no longer just pointing down. It was plummeting. The number flickered. 14.8%. 14.9. No, she whispered, the word a small, broken thing. Then it happened. The number on the screen changed, 15.1%. A collective gasp went through her side of the table. A quiet, horrified intake of breath from a dozen people who had just witnessed the ground vanish from beneath their feet. The room began to spin, not a gentle rotation, but a violent, nauseating lurch. The panoramic view of the Chicago skyline, the city she had looked out on with such possessive pride just an hour ago, blurred into a smear of glass and steel. The faces of her team, once beaming with admiration, were now masks of disbelief and terror. Majority voting shares. The phrase echoed in her head. A tolling bell. It was not about money. It was never about the money. It was about control. The soul of the company, the right to make decisions, the power to set its course. Her father had built this empire on the principle of absolute control. He never gave up a single voting share he didn't have to. Eleanor's mind, usually a fortress of logic and speed, was suddenly a chaotic storm. It scrambled backward in time, desperately trying to find the moment this trap was set. The late-night negotiations, the endless revisions sent back and forth, the red-line documents and the fine print. She had been so focused on the valuation, on the public perception, on the sheer size of the deal. She wanted to build a monument to her father's name so large no one could ever ignore it. She had been so obsessed with winning the battle that she never realized she was walking into a slaughter. Her eyes found Marcus Thorne. He had not moved. He sat perfectly still, his hands clasped loosely on the table before him. He wasn't smiling anymore. That would have been too crude. Instead, his expression was one of placid, almost gentle observation. He looked like a naturalist watching a predictable, fascinating process unfold in the wild. The predator, having sprung its trap, now simply waiting for its prey to exhaust itself. He caught her eye and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was a nod of confirmation, a nod that said, yes, it is exactly what you think it is. I planned this, every single step. The blood drained from Eleanor's face. The stock dip wasn't market jitters. It wasn't random. It was a targeted, deliberate attack, orchestrated, timed to perfection. Marcus had waited until her signature was on the page. He had waited until the deal was irrevocable. He had waited until she was at the absolute peak of her triumph, and then he pushed her off the cliff. You, she breathed, the single word filled with a universe of dawning comprehension and bottomless hatred. Marcus finally spoke, his voice as smooth and cool as polished marble. A simple contingency, Eleanor, to protect the integrity of the acquisition. Given the sudden and unfortunate volatility of your stock, it seems a prudent measure to take. Surely, as a savvy business leader, you can appreciate the necessity. Every word was a perfectly sharpened dart, the condescending praise, the feigned sympathy. He was using her own language against her, mocking the very persona she had so carefully constructed. The ruthless, efficient CEO who never missed a detail. But she had missed the one detail that mattered. Her internal voice, the one that usually spurred her on with ambition and arrogance, was now screaming at her. How? How could you let this happen? You read every line, you challenged every point. But she knew how. She had been blinded by the prize. She saw the billion-dollar valuation and the headlines in the financial press. She saw her father's legacy, finally secured, finally larger than life. She saw victory, and she sprinted toward it, ignoring the tripwire laid right at the finish line. She remembered the man in the parking garage this morning, his calm, unimpressed eyes, his simple flannel shirt. She had dismissed him as an inconvenience, a piece of insignificant dust to be swept away. In her mind, he was the kind of man who worked with his hands, who had no concept of the world she commanded from this glass tower. The irony was a physical blow. She had spent her morning asserting her dominance over a nobody, while the real threat sat across from her, smiling, holding the knife that would end her career. Her hands, still flat on the table, began to tremble. First a faint tremor, then an uncontrollable shaking. She curled them into fists, her manicured nails digging into her palms. The sting was a distant, unimportant pain. The real pain was a cold, hollowing chasm opening in her chest. This wasn't a merger. It was a hostile takeover, executed with the precision of a military strike. And she had signed the surrender papers herself, with a flourish, with a triumphant smile on her face. Ethelred Capital wasn't acquiring Vance Innovations. It was consuming it, and Marcus Thorne, her father's old rival, the man he had always called a smiling shark, was going to pick its bones clean. Chloe moved to her side, a soft presence in the frozen tableau of horror. "Eleanor?" she whispered, her voice laced with deep concern. Eleanor couldn't answer. She couldn't turn her head. Her gaze was locked on the leather-bound agreement in the center of the table. The embossed logos of their two companies seemed to mock her. Vance Innovations and Ethelred Capital. Not partners, not equals, a predator and its prey. The document was no longer a symbol of her achievement. It was a tombstone. It was the physical record of her failure, a testament to her own blinding arrogance. It was so heavy, suddenly impossibly heavy. The weight of her father's name, the future of thousands of employees, the entirety of her life's ambition, all contained within its pages. A weight she had proudly claimed, and a weight that had now crushed her. Her fingers went numb. The feeling simply ceased, as if the connection between her brain and her hand had been severed. She was no longer holding the agreement. It was just resting against her limp, useless fingers. Slowly, gravity took over. The heavy merger agreement tilted, slid from her nerveless grasp and fell. It did not make a loud crack or a sharp bang. It hit the polished mahogany table with a sickening, final thud. The sound was deep and hollow, absorbing all the air and all the hope from the room. It was the sound of a gavel falling for the last time. It was the sound of her empire collapsing. The silence that followed was not empty. It was heavy, a physical weight pressing down on the room, mothering the air from Eleanor's lungs. The thud of the leather-bound agreement on the mahogany table seemed to echo, a final hollow punctuation mark on her life's work. Her eyes were fixed on the document. The elegant script of Clause 11.7b swam before her, the words losing their meaning, becoming nothing more than black marks on a white page. It was a language she no longer understood. Her world had just been neatly folded into a box, and the lid was closing. Around her, the boardroom was a frozen portrait of shock. Her legal team, men and women she paid fortunes to for their supposed omniscience, stared at the contract as if it were a venomous snake. Her CFO, still on the conference line, was utterly silent, the digital connection a dead wire to a world that had ceased to matter. Chloe stood a few feet away, her hand half extended, as if she wanted to reach out but knew any touch would feel like an attack. The pity in her assistant's eyes was the worst part. It was a mirror reflecting a truth Eleanor could not yet accept. She was no longer a figure of power. She was an object of compassion. Then a sound cut through the stillness, a soft, satisfied chuckle. It came from across the table. Eleanor's head lifted slowly, a painful, mechanical motion. Marcus Thorne was looking directly at her, but it was not the Marcus she had known for months. The charming, avuncular mentor, the man who spoke of partnership and shared vision, was gone. In his place was a stranger. The warm, persuasive smile was still on his lips, but it was stretched into a different shape. It was a predator's smile, thin and cold, devoid of all warmth. His eyes, once crinkling with feigned camaraderie, were now two chips of ice, gleaming with the pure, unadulterated light of victory. He leaned forward, placing his manicured hands flat on the polished table. The gesture was slow, deliberate, an act of possession. He was claiming the space. He was claiming her company. He was claiming her. "You see, Eleanor," he began, his voice no longer the smooth baritone of a collaborator, but the sharp cutting edge of a victor. "The market didn't just falter. One does not simply trip and fall into a chasm of this magnitude." He paused, letting the words hang in the suffocating air. It was pushed. A tremor went through Eleanor's hands. She clasped them in her lap, digging her nails into her own palms, trying to anchor herself to a physical sensation. Anything to distract from the spinning in her head. Pushed. The word was an admission, a confession. This was not bad luck. This was not a market fluctuation. This was an assassination. Marcus stood up, his movements fluid and unhurried. He began to circle the table, his expensive shoes making no sound on the thick carpet. He was a shark gliding through still water. "For months, we have been acquiring small, seemingly insignificant positions in your key suppliers and distributors, through a beautiful web of third-party firms and anonymous holding companies, of course. Untraceable, each one a tiny, harmless pinprick on its own." He stopped behind her chair. She could feel his presence, a cold spot in the warm room. She could smell the faint, expensive scent of his cologne. It was the same scent she had associated with mentorship, with success. Now it smelled like decay. "But when you press all those little pinpricks at the same time," he continued, his voice a low murmur right beside her ear, "it creates a hemorrhage, a coordinated sell-off, a rumor planted here, a shipping delay manufactured there. It creates panic. It creates the very instability that your precious clause 11.7b was designed to react to." Her mind raced, trying to find a flaw, a loophole, an escape. There was none. It was too perfect, too clean. He had used the very architecture of the market against her. He had weaponized her own ambition, her desire for a swift, decisive victory. She had been so focused on the finish line that she never saw the tripwire he had laid just before it. "Why, Ego?" The word was a dry rasp torn from her throat. It was the only word she could find. Marcus moved away, resuming his slow patrol of the room. He walked to the vast floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the Chicago skyline. Her skyline. The view she had earned. "Why, hey?" He chuckled again, a sound like ice cracking. "Oh, Eleanor, you really are your father's daughter, so brilliant, yet so incredibly blind. You see a transaction, a merger, numbers on a page. I see a story, a legacy." He turned back to face her, his silhouette framed against the afternoon sun. "Your father, Thomas, was a formidable man, a true titan. He built this empire from nothing, but he was also my rival. He beat me on the Apex deal in '98. He poached my best engineer in 2003. We competed for every contract, every headline, for 20 years. He walked back toward the table, his gaze never leaving hers. He always saw business as a war. And in war, you don't just defeat your enemy, you break them. You dismantle their legacy so completely that no one even remembers their name. He understood that. But you thought this was a partnership." The mention of her father was a physical blow. All her life, she had strived to live up to his name, to make Vance innovations even greater than he had. She wanted to prove she was worthy of his throne. And now this man was using her father's memory as a weapon against her. He was turning her deepest motivation into the source of her deepest shame. "This clause," Marcus said, tapping the contract with a single elegant finger. "This wasn't some legal boilerplate, Eleanor. This was the entire point of the deal. It was the key to a lock you didn't even know existed. We drafted it knowing you would be too impatient, too eager to see your name in the history books, to scrutinize the fine print. We counted on your arrogance, and you did not disappoint." The words hit her one after another like stones. He was right. She remembered her legal team urging a slower review. She remembered brushing them off, telling them to focus on the big picture. She had called them timid. She had believed she saw the whole board, when in reality she was just a pawn in a game she never even knew was being played. The faces of her team were a gallery of averted eyes. No one would look at her. The junior lawyer who had found the clause was staring at his shoes as if they held the secrets of the universe. The CFO on the phone had ended the call without a word. They were already distancing themselves. She was no longer the leader. She was the liability. She was the failure. Marcus stopped in front of her again. He looked down at her, his expression a mask of cold pity. It was the look one gives a crushed insect on the pavement. "According to the terms you so enthusiastically signed less than an hour ago," he stated, his voice now formal, official, and utterly brutal, "the precipitous drop in Vance Innovations' stock value has triggered a transfer of controlling voting shares to Ethelred Capital. That transfer is being ratified by the exchange as we speak. Our legal team is confirming it now." He glanced at one of his own lawyers, who gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Victory, it was done. In approximately, he checked his gold watch, a flash of light in the dimming room, 45 minutes, I will formally convene the new majority board. As the acting chairman and chief executive officer of the newly integrated entity. He let that sink in. The silence in the room was absolute. It was the silence of a grave. Eleanor could hear the blood pounding in her ears, a frantic, useless drumbeat. Marcus leaned down, his face just inches from hers. The mask of pity was gone, replaced by a final, triumphant sneer. "And my first official act," he whispered, the words intended for her alone, yet loud enough for the entire room to feel their weight, "will be to relieve you of your duties, effective immediately. Security will escort you from the building." He straightened up, smoothing the front of his jacket. "You are dismissed, Eleanor." The words did not register at first. They were just sounds. But then they coalesced into a single unbearable truth. Fired. She was being fired from her own company, from her father's company. In front of her team, in the boardroom that was supposed to be the monument to her greatest triumph. She was being thrown out like garbage. The humiliation was a physical force, a white-hot wave that washed over her, burning away everything. Her pride, her ambition, her identity. It all turned to ash. She couldn't breathe. Her chest was a block of ice. She tried to form a word, a protest, a curse. But nothing came. Her throat was closed. Her power, once a roaring fire, was now a single dying ember. There was nothing left to fight with. He had taken everything. Her vision began to blur. She stared at Marcus, but his sharp, victorious face swam and distorted. She saw the faces of her board members, pale and indistinct. She saw Chloe, her expression a mask of pure anguish for her. Eleanor could not stand it. She could not bear their witness to her absolute and total destruction. She broke eye contact, her head falling. She sank back into the plush leather of her chair, the chair at the head of the table. Her father's chair. It offered no comfort. It felt alien, a throne she had usurped and now been violently thrown from. The strength drained from her body, leaving her limp, a puppet with its strings cut. Hot tears began to well in her eyes. They were not tears of sadness. They were tears of pure, impotent rage, tears of searing, bottomless despair. They spilled over, tracing hot tracks down her cold cheeks, a silent admission of her defeat. Through the shimmering veil of her own failure, she looked out the window. The city, her city, the vast panorama of steel and glass she thought she had conquered, blurred into a wash of indistinct lights and shadows. It was no longer a kingdom at her feet. It was just a place she used to work. The city skyline, once a testament to her power, was now just glass and steel mocking her. Eleanor saw her reflection in the panoramic window, a distorted, broken figure against the vast expanse she had fought so hard to conquer. Her vision was blurred by tears she refused to let fall. They were hot, acidic things burning the backs of her eyes. Around her, the summit boardroom was suspended in a strange, thick silence. It was not empty, but the sounds were muffled, as if coming from underwater. The polite clink of a water glass, a nervous cough from someone on her legal team, the rustle of papers being gathered with defeated slowness. Each sound was an indictment, each glance from her own people, a mixture of pity and fear. She was no longer their leader. She was a spectacle, a lesson in failure. Across the mahogany expanse, Marcus Thorne was the picture of magnanimous victory. He spoke in low, soothing tones to his own team, his silver hair catching the afternoon light. He didn't look at her. He didn't have to. His victory was so total, so absolute, that acknowledging her further would be redundant. He had not just won. He had erased her. Her mind kept replaying his words. My first act will be to remove you as CEO. The sentence echoed in the silent chambers of her skull. It was a clean, precise strike, delivered with the casual cruelty of a man swatting a fly. All the years of sleepless nights, of sacrificed relationships, of clawing her way to the top of this glass tower, all of it undone by a single paragraph she had been too arrogant to scrutinize. Her father's face flashed in her mind, his proud smile at her business school graduation, the weight of his hand on her shoulder when he'd first shown her this very boardroom. This will all be yours one day, Eleanor, he had said. Just be smarter than the sharks. She had not been smarter. She had been devoured. She felt a phantom weight in her hand, the ghost of the pen she used to sign her own corporate death warrant. Her fingers were numb, resting on the cool, smooth surface of the table. The billion-dollar agreement, her supposed masterpiece, still sat there. Its dark blue leather cover seemed to absorb all the light in the room, a black hole of her own making. While the rest of Eleanor's team was paralyzed, caught between horror and the instinct for self-preservation, Chloe Davis moved. Her face was pale, her expression tight, but her eyes held a spark of defiance that had been extinguished in everyone else. She looked at Eleanor, a fleeting expression of profound sympathy crossing her face, before her gaze hardened with resolve. She would not let this happen. Not like this. There had to be something. Some leverage, some forgotten detail. Quietly, Chloe slipped away from the main table, moving to a small credenza against the wall where her work tablet was charging. Her movements were precise, economical, betraying none of the frantic urgency that hammered in her chest. The others were already mentally updating their resumes, calculating their severance packages. Chloe was reloading her weapon. Her fingers flew across the screen. She ignored the stock tickers, the panicked headlines now flooding the financial news networks. That was the battlefield Marcus had chosen. She needed to find a different one. Her strategy was born of desperation. If the contract was a fortress, she would not attack the walls. She would find the king who built it. Ethelred Capital. Everyone knew the name. Few knew anything about its substance. It was a ghost in the market, a behemoth holding company with a portfolio so vast and diversified it was nearly impossible to track. And at its heart was a founder who was more myth than man. No interviews, no photos, no public appearances in over 2 decades. He was a phantom, his anonymity the ultimate power. His name was not even on the merger documents. It was signed by Marcus Thorne, CEO. But Thorne was not the source. He was the instrument. Chloe's first searches yielded nothing. The usual corporate filings, SEC documents that listed shell corporations within shell corporations, a labyrinth of legal entities designed to obscure. She typed in every conceivable keyword: Ethelred founder, Ethelred owner, Ethelred Capital secret shareholder. The results were useless. Recycled articles praising the firm's mysterious success. Blog posts with whirling, unsubstantiated conspiracy theories. One even suggested the founder was a rogue artificial intelligence. She felt a wave of despair. The clock was ticking. Marcus had said he would assume control in less than an hour. That meant the board transfer was already in motion. The mechanisms were grinding forward, unstoppable. She looked over at Eleanor, who hadn't moved. She was a statue of grief, her sharp suit and severe hairstyle a mockery of the power she no longer possessed. Chloe's resolve hardened. She would not let Eleanor's father's legacy be dismantled by this vulture. Not for this. She changed her approach. Instead of searching for the invisible founder, she started digging into the visible man. Marcus Thorne. His digital footprint was pristine, curated, a series of puff pieces in business magazines, quotes in press releases, photos of him at charity galas, smiling his predator's smile. It was a perfect corporate history, with no rough edges. Too perfect. Chloe went deeper. She pulled up academic and trade publication archives, databases that stored the unglamorous, forgotten history of the industry. She searched for Thorne's name, but filtered the results to before he was CEO, before he was anyone important. She went back 10 years, then 15. The results grew thinner. She pushed it to 20 years back. A list of grainy, low-resolution PDFs appeared on her screen. Old industry newsletters, scanned and uploaded with minimal formatting. Most were irrelevant. Reports on outdated technology, announcements of promotions for people who were now long retired. It was a digital graveyard. Her heart sank. This was a fool's errand, a desperate, hopeless search for a needle in a continent of haystacks. She was about to give up when her eyes caught a headline from a small, defunct Washington policy journal. The date was from 22 years ago. Senator Thompson applauds bipartisan efforts in tech deregulation. It was boring, forgettable. But Marcus Thorne's name was in the body of the text, listed as a junior associate for a lobbying firm that had consulted on the bill. Ethelred wasn't mentioned. It probably hadn't even existed in its current form. Driven by a final, inexplicable impulse, Chloe tapped on the single low-quality image embedded in the article. The image was pixelated, the colors washed out by time and poor scanning. It showed a small gathering, maybe a fundraiser or a press event. A smiling, portly senator stood in the center, shaking a man's hand. In the background, partially obscured by a potted plant, stood a younger Marcus Thorne. He wore an ill-fitting suit, his hair darker, his ambition not yet masked by a veneer of charm. He was watching the handshake, an aide hovering in the orbit of true power. Chloe felt a strange jolt. It was the posture, the way Thorne was observing, learning, waiting. She almost dismissed the photo, but her gaze was drawn back to the two men in the foreground. The senator was generic, a politician's smile plastered on his face. But the other man, he was dressed simply, in a dark suit that looked respectable but not ostentatious. His face was weathered, kind lines around his eyes. He had a calm, steady presence that contrasted with the senator's forced charisma. There was something intensely familiar about him, the set of his jaw, the quiet intelligence in his eyes. Chloe's breath caught in her throat. Where had she seen that face before? Her eyes darted to the caption below the photograph. The text was tiny, blurred from the scan. She pinched the screen, zooming in, the pixels distorting into abstract squares before resolving back into fuzzy letters. Her heart began to pound, a slow, heavy drum against her ribs. Senator Thompson thanks key industry supporter Samuel Jones, founder of Ethelred Capital, for his private contributions to the initiative. The name hung there, Samuel Jones, Ethelred Capital, the ghost, the myth. But it wasn't the name that made the world stop. It was the face from this morning. The memory hit Chloe with the force of a physical blow, the cold concrete of the parking garage, the echoing drip of water, the imposing black grille of Eleanor's sedan inches from the dented fender of a rusty pickup truck. And the man in the worn flannel shirt and dusty work boots, his hands calloused, his face etched with a patient, weary calm. The man Eleanor had screamed at. The man whose vehicle she had called a disgusting piece of junk. The man she had ordered security to throw out before having his truck towed away like a piece of garbage. It was him. It was the same man. Chloe stared at the tablet, her blood running cold. The two images merged in her mind. The man in the simple suit shaking a senator's hand, and the man in the flannel shirt standing beside a pickup truck. The face was older now, the hair grayer, but the eyes were the same. The calm, observant, unreadable eyes. Samuel Jones, the reclusive, anonymous, multi-billionaire founder of Ethelred Capital, the man who moved markets with a whisper, did not drive a luxury car. He did not have a chauffeur. He drove a dusty, 20-year-old pickup truck. And this morning he had parked it in Eleanor Vance's spot. The pieces slammed together in Chloe's mind, forming a picture of such catastrophic irony that she felt dizzy. This was never about the stock price. This was never about synergies or market consolidation. It wasn't even about Marcus Thorne's ambition. It was a test, a personal, secret evaluation of character conducted by the one man whose opinion actually mattered. He had come to see the person he was about to merge with, not the CEO in the boardroom, but the human being in the garage. He had given Eleanor a simple choice, a moment of no consequence, where she could have shown grace or patience or even basic human decency, and she had failed in the most spectacular, arrogant, and self-destructive way imaginable. She hadn't just insulted a truck driver, she had spat in the face of the king without ever realizing he wasn't wearing his crown. The clause in the contract, the stock manipulation, Marcus Thorne's predatory glee, it was all just the consequence. The fallout from a test that had been failed hours before the first signature was even written. Chloe's hands were shaking as she looked up from the tablet. The low hum of the boardroom returned, but it sounded different now. The whispers of her colleagues were not just about a lost deal. They were the sounds of an empire crumbling because its empress had been cruel to a man in a flannel shirt. Marcus Thorne's victory was not a masterstroke of corporate rating. It was a punishment, a sentence handed down by a judge who had already witnessed the crime firsthand. She had to tell Eleanor. With leaden feet, Chloe pushed herself away from the credenza. She walked across the vast, silent expanse of the boardroom, the tablet held in her hands like a stone slab bearing a terrible prophecy. The few people who noticed her looked on with curiosity. Marcus Thorne, catching the movement, finally turned his head, a flicker of annoyance in his eyes at the interruption of his triumph. Chloe ignored him. She ignored everyone. Her entire world had narrowed to the broken figure of Eleanor Vance, still staring out at the city she had just lost. She reached the head of the table. Eleanor didn't look up. Her gaze was distant, fixed on nothing. "Eleanor?" Chloe whispered. Her voice was hoarse. There was no response. Chloe took a deep breath. She couldn't say the words. She couldn't form the sentence that would connect this morning's petty tyranny to this afternoon's total ruin. The truth was too monstrous. It had to be seen. Slowly, deliberately, she placed the tablet on the polished mahogany surface, directly in Eleanor's line of sight. She slid it forward until it was right in front of her. The screen glowed, an island of light in the dimming afternoon. Eleanor flinched at the sudden intrusion of light. Her head moved with an agonizing slowness, her eyes unfocused, clouded with despair. For a long moment, she just stared at the glowing rectangle, not comprehending what it was. Then her gaze began to focus. It drifted over the pixelated image, the senator, the younger Marcus Thorne in the background, and the man in the center. Her expression was blank at first. It was just a picture, another piece of meaningless data in a day full of disastrous information. She started to look away, to retreat back into the fog of her defeat. But something held her, a flicker of recognition, a ghost of a memory. She leaned closer. Her hand, which had been lying limp on the table, twitched. Her brow furrowed in confusion. Her mind, shattered and slow, was trying to connect the dots. The weathered face, the calm eyes, that look of quiet, unassuming patience. Her eyes dropped to the caption. She read the name, Samuel Jones. The name meant nothing. She read the title, founder of Ethelred Capital. The words seemed to swim, to warp. It didn't make sense. The founder was a myth, a ghost. Then her eyes shot back to the face in the photo, and she remembered. The cold, the smell of exhaust, the righteous fury, the words she had spat like venom. "Get this disgusting piece of junk out of my sight." The man's calm, patient expression as she tore him apart. The face in the 20-year-old photograph and the face from the parking garage became one. The truth did not dawn on Eleanor Vance. It struck her like lightning, a brutal, physical shock that traveled from her eyes straight to her core. Every muscle in her body went rigid. The air was stolen from her lungs. She stared at the calm, weathered face of Samuel Jones on the screen, the man whose truck she had towed, the man whose empire was about to swallow hers whole. A single choked gasp, a sound of pure, unadulterated horror, escaped her lips. The face on the tablet was not a mask of corporate power. It was weathered, etched with lines that spoke of sun and patience, not boardrooms and hostile takeovers. His eyes, a calm and knowing gray, stared back at her from the grainy photograph. Samuel Jones. The caption was simple, a footnote in a forgotten industry journal. But for Eleanor Vance, it was the final, crushing sentence of her life story. The air left her lungs in a single choked gasp that was swallowed by the cavernous silence of the room. Her world, once a towering skyscraper of ambition, had just been reduced to a pile of rubble and a dusty parking lot. Around her, the chaos was a distant hum. Marcus Thorne's voice, thick with triumph, was a meaningless drone. Her legal team scrambled, their whispers like the rustling of dry leaves. Chloe was at her side, a hand on her arm, her voice a soft murmur of concern. Eleanor felt none of it. She saw nothing but that face, the face of the man she had dismissed, the man she had insulted, the man whose simple pickup truck she had ordered towed away like a piece of garbage. He was not an obstacle. He was the judge, the jury, and the executioner, all hidden behind a flannel shirt and a kind smile. A fire born not of anger, but of pure, desperate survival ignited within her. She stood up. The movement was so abrupt it silenced the room. Marcus paused mid-sentence, a flicker of confusion crossing his victorious expression. Chloe's grip tightened. "Eleanor, what are you doing?" But Eleanor was already moving. She didn't look back. She didn't offer a single word of explanation. To explain would be to acknowledge their victory. Her only path forward was a desperate retreat to the very beginning of her mistake. She walked out of the summit boardroom, her heels clicking a frantic rhythm on the marble floor. She left behind the billion-dollar agreement, her title, her future. She left behind the stunned faces of her team and the cold, predatory gaze of Marcus Thorne. She strode past her own office, a place that now felt like a tomb, and stabbed the button for the elevator. The ride down felt like a free fall through the 90 floors of her failed ambition. Each descending level was a layer of pride being stripped away. The doors opened into the main lobby, and she didn't slow down. People turned to stare at the CEO moving with such uncontained panic, her immaculate composure shattered into a million pieces. She burst through the doors to the security office, a small, windowless room filled with monitors. The chief of security, a stout man named Thomas, jumped to his feet, his face a mixture of surprise and alarm. "Miss Vance, is everything all right?" His question was a foolish luxury she could not afford. "The truck," she said, her voice strained, breathless. "The pickup truck from my space this morning. Where was it taken?" Thomas blinked, completely lost. "The truck? You mean the one we had towed?" "Ma'am, The address," she snapped, the last vestige of her authority lashing out like a whip. "I need the address of the impound lot, now." Fumbling with his keyboard, he pulled up the report. He scribbled an address on a small piece of paper. Eleanor snatched it from his hand before the ink was dry and was gone, leaving him staring at the empty doorway. Outside, the midday Chicago air was thick and humid. She didn't wait for her driver. She ran to the curb, her hand raised, hailing a taxi with a desperation she had only ever seen in movies. A yellow cab screeched to a halt in front of her. She wrenched the door open and threw herself inside, shoving the piece of paper at the driver. "Get me here as fast as you can." The driver glanced at the address, then at her disheveled state, her tailored suit now rumpled, her hair escaping its severe bun. He simply nodded and pulled into traffic. The city slid past the window. Towers of glass and steel that had once been symbols of her domain now seemed to mock her. She saw her own reflection in the window, a pale, haunted specter. The powerful woman from this morning was gone. In her place was a terrified ghost, racing toward the one man who could either save her or banish her forever. Her mind replayed the morning in excruciating detail. His calm voice, her vicious, cutting words. "People like you don't belong here." The memory burned her throat with shame. She had not been judging his truck. She had been judging his worth. And she had been catastrophically, unforgivably wrong. The taxi left the polished gleam of downtown behind, venturing into older industrial parts of the city. The skyscrapers gave way to brick warehouses and low-slung buildings. The clean, filtered air of her tower was replaced by the scent of exhaust and fried food from street vendors. It was a world she never saw, a world she had believed herself to be above. After what felt like an eternity, the cab slowed and turned onto a gravel road. It pulled up beside a high chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. A faded sign read City Vehicle Impound Lot 7. This was it, the end of the line. Eleanor paid the driver with a crumpled bill from her wallet, not even waiting for the change. She stepped out of the bomb and onto the dusty, uneven ground. The air smelled of oil, sun-baked dirt, and defeat. Rows of cars sat in silent, sun-beaten lines. Cars with parking violations, cars from accidents, cars that had been abandoned. Each one represented a story of misfortune or mistake, and now her story was one of them. She saw him almost immediately. He was standing near the exit gate, next to his dusty blue pickup truck. It looked exactly the same, a monument to everything she had misunderstood. He wasn't looking for her, he was at a small, greasy window, calmly counting out cash into the hand of a bored-looking attendant, her heart hammered against her ribs. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to hide, to disappear. The pride that had been her armor for her entire life was now a cage of her own making, and to approach him, she would have to break it open. She took a breath, then another, and then she began to walk. Each step on the loose gravel was a confession. Her expensive heels, made for polished floors and red carpets, sank slightly into the dirt. She felt the eyes of the lot attendants on her, this woman in a power suit walking through their grimy kingdom. But her focus was singular. It was on the man in the flannel shirt who now held the fate of her father's legacy in his work-worn hands. He finished his transaction and turned from the window, pocketing a receipt. He looked at his truck, running a hand over a small dent on the fender with a familiar sort of affection. He hadn't noticed her yet. She was only a few yards away now. Her throat was dry gnawing. The words she needed to say were lodged there, heavy and sharp. "Mr. Jones," she said. Her voice was a cracked whisper, nothing like the commanding tone she was used to. Samuel Jones turned slowly. His gray eyes met hers, and for a long moment there was no surprise in them, no anger, no triumph. There was only a quiet, patient watchfulness, as if he had been expecting her all along. He just stood there, waiting. The silence was her judgment. It stretched on, forcing her to be the one to break it, to be the one to confess. The first tear escaped, tracing a hot, shameful path down her cheek. The dam of her composure broke, and everything came flooding out. "I am so sorry," she began, the words stumbling over each other, raw and unpracticed. Her voice broke completely. "This morning, in the garage, what I said to you, what I did, there is no excuse." She looked down at the dirt, unable to meet his gaze. "I was arrogant, and I was cruel. It had nothing to do with a parking space. It was about me, my own fear, my own ugliness." Another tear fell, then another. She wasn't performing. She wasn't negotiating. She was disintegrating. This was the most honest moment of her entire life, happening in the ugliest place she had ever been. She finally forced herself to look up, to meet his steady, unreadable eyes. The city she had wanted to conquer was miles away. The only thing that mattered was the space between her and this man. With tears streaming down her face, she looked him in the eye and whispered, "I was wrong. Please, you're the only one who can help me." Her plea hung in the dusty air of the impound lot. Sam Jones simply watched her. His gray eyes held no pity and no triumph, just the steady gaze of a man weighing a decision. He was completely still. "I don't invest in companies, Ms. Vance," he said, his voice calm. "I invest in people, in character." He gestured toward the city skyline, barely visible through the haze. "A building can be rebuilt. Money can be re-earned. But character is the foundation. If it's cracked, the whole structure is worthless." Each word was a stone building a wall around her. This was worse than a corporate attack. Marcus Thorne had gone after her business. Sam Jones was dismantling her soul. "This morning," he continued, "I saw a leader who believed her parking spot was more important than a person. You saw an obstacle. You saw a flannel shirt in an old truck, and you made a judgment. That told me everything I needed to know." Shame rose in her throat, hot and acidic. He was right. She had not seen a man. She had only seen a disruption to her perfect, calculated day. She had looked at him and marked him as a zero. Now, that zero held her entire world in his calloused hands. He watched her pride finally shatter, not into rage, but into a quiet, devastating sorrow. He saw the raw pain of self-awareness in her eyes. After a long moment, he nodded slowly. "But foundations can be repaired," he said softly, "if the owner is willing to do the work." With that, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, dark blue flip phone. He flipped it open with his thumb. The small screen cast a pale, pixelated light on his face. He pressed a single button for speed dial and held the phone to his ear. "It's Sam," he said. A pause. Veto the Vance acquisition. Clause 11.7 is nullified. Effective immediately. He listened for another second, then snapped the phone shut. The click echoed in the silence like a gavel. It was done. $1 billion hostile takeover, erased in 5 seconds. Eleanor stood frozen. I I don't understand, she whispered. Marcus Thorne is a manager, Miss Vance. I am the owner, Sam said simply. He tucked the phone back into his pocket. He was authorized to proceed based on my assessment of your leadership. My assessment was incomplete. He looked toward his truck, then back at her. The hostile takeover is finished. The original offer is back on the table. A fair merger. Your company remains intact, and you remain its CEO. Your father's legacy is safe. Relief washed over Eleanor so powerfully her knees felt weak. But before it could fully take hold, he raised a hand. There is a condition, he said, his expression serious again. The deal proceeds, but my investment is now in you personally, and your education is just beginning. You're going to become my apprentice. Eleanor blinked. Your apprentice? An apprentice in humility, he clarified. You're brilliant with strategy. You know how to build a company. You don't know how to build character. You will spend 1 week a month working with me, not in a boardroom. You'll be here. He patted the dusty fender of his pickup truck. You will learn to see the person, not the title. Her mind reeled. The old Eleanor would have laughed. It was an impossible, insulting proposition. But the old Eleanor was gone. The woman standing here was someone else. Someone broken, but also awake. She looked from Sam's challenging eyes to the old truck. It was no longer a piece of junk. It was a classroom. Her skyscraper felt a million miles away, a cold and lonely spire. This dusty lot felt real. She finally met his gaze. A flicker of her old strength returned, but it was different now. It was a quiet resolve. She gave a single, deliberate nod. Okay, she said. The word was small, but it was the heaviest one she had ever spoken. A faint smile touched the corners of Sam's mouth. Good, he said. He walked around to the driver's side door. My assistant will call your office tomorrow to arrange the schedule. Be ready to get your hands dirty, Eleanor. He used her first name. It was not a sign of condescension. It was the simple acknowledgement of a teacher speaking to a student. He climbed into the cab, and the engine turned over with a low, reliable rumble. With a final nod to her through the dusty windshield, he pulled away. Eleanor stood alone in the grimy impound lot. She watched the red taillights of the old pickup truck disappear down the road, leaving her in the growing twilight, miles from her glass tower.